Along with new trends in culture and society, political agendas, technological advances in industrialism, and scientific discoveries during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, new methods of thinking and creating emerged. The Modernism time period, which influenced art, design, literature, and philosophy, led to an immense cultural transformation. In the years following World War I, societies distanced themselves from the aftermath of wartime, becoming industrialized and advanced. Cities began to experience quick growth, while their residents, especially artists, writers, and philosophers, adopted different views and beliefs. In fact, the definition of modernism reflects a shift away from traditional art, philosophy, religion, literature, and daily life. Modernists, however, were not creating a new age of enlightenment. They were, in fact, against this certain way of thinking, and many even rejected religion. Poet Ezra Pound's famous 1934 line, "Make it new," came to symbolize the forward-thinking approach and characteristics of modernism. It meant doing away with an outdated past and embracing, as the Tate Modern describes, ideal visions of human life and society and a belief in progress. What is modernism in art history? Modernism in art encompasses various techniques, styles, and media. However, the underlying defining principles hold true in art that emerged from the movement: a rejection of history in traditional concepts like realism, innovation and experimentation, shown in abstract shapes, colors, and lines, and an emphasis on new materials and techniques. One common characteristic of modernism was self-consciousness as it related to art and social traditions, which led artists to experiment with form. Techniques that specifically drew attention to the creation process itself, and the specific materials used, were also characteristic of the period. Examples of modernism in art. Beginning in the late 1900s, artists played with new materials and techniques to create works they believed better portrayed modern societies and daily life. From early modernism in art came Impressionism, followed by Expressionism, and later Fauvism, Cubism, and abstract art. Below are brief definitions of each influential modernist movement. Impressionism, a 19th-century movement characterized by small, thin brush strokes, open composition, and emphasis on the accurate depiction of light, ordinary subjects, and perceived movement in time and space. Key influencers include French artists Claude Monet, Pierre-Auguste Renoir, Edouard Manet, and Paul Cézanne. Expressionism, an early 20th-century movement that initially emerged in poetry and painting and originated in Germany. Expressionists present the world solely from a subjective perspective, portraying distortions meant to evoke meaning or emotional experience instead of physical reality. Notable expressionists include El Greco, Vasily Kandinsky, and Edvard Munch. Fauvism, the artistic style of Les Fauvres, French for the Wild Beasts, which was a 20th-century group of modern artists who painted with strong colors and strayed away from the more realistic values of Impressionists. André Derain and Henri Matisse became known as the leaders of the Fauvist movement, which lasted from around 1904 to 1910. Cubism, an avant-garde movement that began in Europe in the early 20th century. It is considered the most influential art movement of the 20th century, and revolutionized painting and sculpture. Started by Pablo Picasso and Georges Braque, it involved the representation of three-dimensional forms. Origins of the movement can be seen in Paul Cézanne's later works. Cubists like Picasso became famous for depicting broken-up and reassembled objects, in abstract form with multiple viewpoints. Today, the terms modernism and modern art describe the succession of art movements including those mentioned above. Following Fauvism and Cubism, abstract art, art that incorporates complete, partial, or slight abstraction, or a departure from realism in representation, extended into other movements of the mid-20th century. By the 1960s, abstract art was widespread, and modernist ideas
Making it new, modernism in literature. The modernist movement in literature, or literary modernism, involved experimentations among writers with new forms and expressions. Starting with Ezra Pound's "Make It New," the the movement in literature covers technological advances, changes in culture and society, and the transition into the 20th century. Early modernist writers, like their artist counterparts, stemmed away from traditional values and abandoned their duty of representing mainstream culture and ideas to the public. Instead, they developed the concept of the unreliable narrator. Writers also addressed discoveries introduced by Charles Darwin, Sigmund Freud, Albert Einstein, and others. Thus, other techniques in literature emerged like stream of consciousness, multiple points of view, and interior monologue. Modernism in literature began with works like Joseph Conrad's 1899 novella Heart of Darkness, and later Sherwood Anderson's 1919 short story Winesburg, Ohio, which became known for plain-spoken words and characters' psychological insight. Another notable modernist writer is James Joyce, famous for his 1922 novel Ulysses, which uniquely described events over a 24-hour period in his protagonist's life. This piece of literature came to define the modernist approach to fiction. Other instrumental works of the period include T.S. Eliot's 1922 poem The Waste Land, fragmented and lacking a central narrative, and Gertrude Stein's 1914 book Tender Buttons, which was also fragmented and incorporated multiple perspectives. It has thus been compared to her good friend Pablo Picasso's Cubist paintings. While moving towards the new, modernist writers and musicians made reference to past works by employing techniques like reprise, rewriting, revision, and parody. Modernist architecture and design. The modernism movement also expanded into architecture and design. Frank Lloyd Wright, for example, employed modernist principles in his belief that as advances in technology turned older, traditional buildings turned obsolete. Elsewhere, Swiss-French architect and designer Le Corbusier saw buildings as machines for living in. As cars, or machines for traveling in, replaced horse-drawn carriages, modernist designs should, too, move on from older structures. Following this belief, modernist designers rejected traditional decorative motifs, emphasizing, as did painters and sculptors of the era, materials used in building and geometric forms. Two prime examples of modernist buildings include the Wainwright Building, built in 1890–91 and complete with 10 stories. Later, built from 1956 to 58, Ludwig Mies van der Rohe's Seagram Building in New York became known as the pinnacle of modernist high-rises. Modernism in literature began with works like Joseph Conrad's 1899 novella Heart of Darkness, and later Sherwood Anderson's 1919 short story Winesburg, Ohio, which became known for plain-spoken words and characters' psychological insight. Another notable modernist writer is James Joyce, famous for his 1922 novel Ulysses, which uniquely described events over a 24-hour period in his protagonist's life. This piece of literature came to define the modernist approach to fiction. Other instrumental works of the period include T.S. Eliot's 1922 poem The Waste Land, fragmented and lacking a central narrative, and Gertrude Stein's 1914 book Tender Buttons, which was also fragmented and incorporated multiple perspectives. It has thus been compared to her good friend Pablo Picasso's Cubist paintings. While moving towards the new, modernist writers and musicians made reference to past works by employing techniques like reprise, rewriting, revision, and parody. Modernist architecture and design. The modernism movement also expanded into architecture and design. Frank Lloyd Wright, for example, employed modernist principles in his belief that as advances in technology turned older, traditional buildings turned obsolete. Elsewhere, Swiss-French architect and designer Le Corbusier saw buildings as machines for living in. As cars, or machines for traveling in, replaced horse-drawn carriages, modernist designs should, too, move on from older structures. Following this belief, modernist designers rejected traditional decorative motifs, emphasizing, as did painters and sculptors of the era, materials used in building and geometric forms. Two prime examples of modernist buildings include the Wainwright Building, built in 1890–91 and complete with 10 stories. Later, Built from 1956 to 58, Ludwig Mies van der Rohe's Seagram building in New York became known as the pinnacle of modernist high-rises. In contrast to elaborate pre-war designs, modernist furniture, too, was largely undecorated. Designers emphasized comfort and functionality, and furniture pieces were designed to be affordable and mass-produced thanks to industrialization. Two important movements that involved such furniture types included the German Bauhaus and the Dutch De Stijl. In modernist furniture design, new materials beyond wood were used, including steel and plastic. The use of neutral colors, especially in chromed finishes and in leather, was also popular. In addition to architects and furniture designers Le Corbusier and Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, famous furniture makers of the era included Eileen Gray, who made pieces with elegant, clean lines, and Marcel Breuer, who was popular for his tubular steel structures. Modernism versus postmodernism. While some experts believe that modernist principles live on, now well into the 21st century, others believe it evolved into late or high modernism. Postmodernism, on the contrary, emerged in the mid to late 20th century and symbolized a deliberate departure from modernist values. It involved a wide range of approaches in art, literature, design, and beyond. Postmodernism is often defined by attitudes of skepticism, irony, or rejection of modernist ideologies. Postmodernists, who rose to the spotlight in the 1980s and 90s, critiqued concepts like truth, human nature, science, reason, morality, and social progress. As Tate Modern describes it, because postmodernism broke the established rules about style, it introduced a new era of freedom and a sense that anything goes. Often funny, tongue-in-cheek or ludicrous, it can be confrontational and controversial. Postmodern critiques and attitudes covered the sciences, economics, architecture, feminist theory, literary criticism, and art movements in contemporary art and beyond. Deconstruction and institutional critique were common schools of thought during the period. Artists of the movement experimented with conceptual, digital, and performance art, among other styles. Jeff Koons is one such prominent postmodern artist.
In The Great Gatsby, Fitzgerald blends the intense symbolism and figurative language of modernism with the social and psychological believability of realism. Realism was a literary movement that originated in the mid-19th century. Realism seeks to depict the world and people as they really are. Realist writers employ specific details and psychologically complex, believable characters to provide insight into human nature and society. They were reacting against Romanticism, a previous dominant 19th-century school of literary thought, which portrays an idealized world characterized by intense emotion. Realist authors George Eliot, Henry James, and Mark Twain set their novels in recognizable locations, incorporated acute observations and meticulous detail, and were more interested in complex, flawed characters than traditional archetypes. Their plots often prioritized characters' emotional conflicts over dramatic external events. While all realism, whether set in a country manor or on the Mississippi, contains social commentary, social realism specifically critiques a social or political issue. For example, Charles Dickens's Bleak House satirizes the complicated legal system of Victorian England. Modernism was a literary and artistic movement that began in the 1900s, as a response to the rise in technology and urbanization in the wake of the Industrial Revolution. Like realists, modernist writers were interested in the individual, internal experience, and drew on theories of the unconscious to mine their characters' inner lives. But modernists were also interested in stylistic experimentation, fashioning new literary forms to explore breakdowns in traditional modes of communication and questioning the very nature of reality itself. Their work expressed concerns about automation at the turn of the century, and, later, horror at the First World War and its aftermath. Following the war, several American writers, including Fitzgerald, moved to Paris and began meeting at the home of the poet Gertrude Stein. The writers of this so-called lost generation strove to represent the struggle of the individual in the face of the chaos, anonymity, and alienating effects of modernity. In Ulysses, James Joyce incorporated made-up words and obscure references, representing the impossibility of truly understanding anything in the world. Stream of consciousness, another non-traditional narrative form, popularized by Virginia Woolf in Mrs. Dalloway and To the Lighthouse, sought to replicate the continuous, unedited nature of individual thought. Because he was writing at the height of modernism and interacted with famous proponents of the movement such as Gertrude Stein, Fitzgerald is most often remembered as an American modernist. And The Great Gatsby has many modernist elements. At the end of the book, Nick references the artist El Greco, a 16th-century painter who has been called the first modernist for the way his paintings distorted figures and fractured color to investigate surface reality. Similarly, many of Gatsby's descriptions, blue smoke, a grotesque rose, shining dust, are poetic distortions of reality. The characterization of automobiles, and technology in general, as dangerous yet alluring also reflect modernist anxieties about automation. At the same time, The Great Gatsby does not fully belong to modernism because of its many realist attributes such as setting, detail, and social commentary. The novel's satiric portrayal of many characters critiques American concepts of social mobility, and the novel on a whole can be read as an examination into the false promise of the American dream. Fitzgerald's approach to character is more realist than modernist in that he explores how characters function in their social milieu, rather than concentrating entirely on the inner world of one or two protagonists. Ultimately, the novel utilizes both styles in Nick Carraway, a young man from Minnesota, moves to New York in the summer of 1922 to learn about the bond business. He rents a house in the West Egg district of Long Island, a wealthy but unfashionable area populated by the new rich, a group who have made their fortunes too recently to have established social connections and who are prone to garish displays of wealth. Nick's next-door neighbor in West Egg is a mysterious man named J. Gatsby, who lives in a gigantic Gothic mansion and throws extravagant parties every Saturday night. Nick is unlike the other inhabitants of West Egg. He was educated at Yale and has social connections in East Egg, a fashionable area of Long Island home to the established upper class. Nick drives out to East Egg one evening for dinner with his cousin, Daisy Buchanan, and her husband, Tom, an erstwhile classmate of Nick's at Yale. Daisy and Tom introduce Nick to Jordan Baker, a beautiful, cynical young woman with whom Nick begins a romantic relationship. Nick also learns a bit about Daisy and Tom's marriage. Jordan tells him that Tom has a lover, Myrtle Wilson, who lives in the Valley of Ashes, a gray industrial dumping ground between West Egg and New York City. Not long after this revelation, Nick travels to New York City with Tom and Myrtle. At a vulgar, gaudy party in the apartment that Tom keeps for the affair, Myrtle begins to taunt Tom about Daisy, and Tom responds by breaking her nose. As the summer progresses, Nick eventually garners an invitation to one of Gatsby's legendary parties. He encounters Jordan Baker at the party, and they meet Gatsby himself, a surprisingly young man who affects an English accent, has a remarkable smile, and calls everyone "old sport." Gatsby asks to speak to Jordan alone, and, through Jordan, Nick later learns more about his mysterious neighbor. Gatsby tells Jordan that he knew Daisy in Louisville in 1917 and is deeply in love with her. He spends many nights staring at the green light at the end of her dock, across the bay from his mansion. Gatsby's extravagant lifestyle and wild parties are simply an attempt to impress Daisy. Gatsby now wants Nick to arrange a reunion between himself and Daisy, but he is afraid that Daisy will refuse to see him if she knows that he still loves her. Nick invites Daisy to have tea at his house, without telling her that Gatsby will also be there. After an initially awkward reunion, Gatsby and Daisy re-establish their connection. Their love rekindled, they begin an affair. After a short time, Tom grows increasingly suspicious of his wife's relationship with Gatsby. At a luncheon at the Buchanan's house, Gatsby stares at Daisy with such undisguised passion that Tom realizes Gatsby is in love with her. Though Tom is himself involved in an extramarital affair, he is deeply outraged by the thought that his wife could be unfaithful to him. He forces the group to drive into New York City, where he confronts Gatsby in a suite at the Plaza Hotel. Tom asserts that he and Daisy have a history that Gatsby could never understand, and he announces to his wife that Gatsby is a criminal. His fortune comes from bootlegging alcohol and other illegal activities. Daisy realizes that her allegiance is to Tom, and Tom contemptuously sends her back to East Egg with Gatsby, attempting to prove that Gatsby cannot hurt him. When Nick, Jordan, and Tom drive through the Valley of Ashes, however, they discover that Gatsby's car has struck and killed Myrtle, Tom's lover. They rush back to Long Island, where Nick learns from Gatsby that Daisy was driving the car when it struck Myrtle, but that Gatsby intends to take the blame. The next day, Tom tells Myrtle's husband, George, that Gatsby was the driver of the car. George, who has leapt to the conclusion that the driver of the car that killed Myrtle must have been her lover, finds Gatsby in the pool at his mansion and shoots him dead. He then fatally shoots himself. Nick stages a small funeral for Gatsby, ends his relationship with Jordan, and moves back to the Midwest to escape the disgust he feels for the people surrounding Gatsby's life and for the emptiness and moral decay of life among the wealthy on the East Coast. Nick reflects that just as Gatsby's dream of Daisy was corrupted by money and dishonesty, the American dream of happiness and individualism has disintegrated into the mere pursuit of wealth. Though Gatsby's power to transform his dreams into reality is what makes him great, Nick reflects that the era of dreams. The Great Gatsby is a story about the impossibility of recapturing the past and also the difficulty of altering one's future. The protagonist of the novel is Jay Gatsby, who is the mysterious and wealthy neighbor of the narrator, Nick Carraway. Although we know little about Gatsby at first, we know from Nick's introduction, and from the book's title, that Gatsby's story will be the focus of the novel. As the novel progresses and Nick becomes increasingly drawn into Gatsby's complicated world, we learn what Gatsby wants: Daisy, Nick's cousin, the girl he once loved. Anything and anyone that stands between Gatsby and Daisy becomes an antagonist. Although Daisy's brutish husband Tom is the most obvious antagonist, a variety of more abstract concepts, such as class difference, societal expectations, and Gatsby's past lies, can also be considered antagonists. The most powerful antagonist is time itself, which prevents Gatsby from recapturing what he lost. After a brief passage which frames the narrative as Nick's recollections of a summer from his past, the narrative is for the most part linear, beginning with Nick's move to New York, which makes him Gatsby's neighbor. Gatsby is wealthy, with a mysterious past that is the subject of much speculation. After meeting his neighbor at a party, Nick learns that despite Gatsby's success, he longs only for Daisy. Gatsby's central aim through the novel is to see Daisy again and recapture their shared past. On a trip to the city with Tom, Nick meets Tom's mistress, Myrtle. In the rising action of the novel, Nick arranges a reunion between Gatsby and Daisy, and Jordan tells Nick about Daisy and Gatsby's history. Gatsby and Daisy fall back in love, and Gatsby tells Nick one version of his life story. Many of the stories Gatsby tells about himself turn out to be lies or half-truths. The fantastic nature of his stories gives Gatsby's history a mythical quality, which reinforces the sense of him as a tragic hero. Gatsby and Daisy are briefly happy together, and Nick gets drawn into their romance, even though the outlook for the couple's future seems hopeless, largely because of Gatsby's inability to separate his dreams from reality. Both the reader and Nick can see the disparity between Gatsby's idealized image of the Daisy he knew 5 years earlier, and the actual character of Daisy herself. Fitzgerald presents Daisy as a shallow, materialistic character, reinforcing the sense that Gatsby is chasing a dream, rather than a real person. There must have been moments even that afternoon when Daisy tumbled short of his dreams. It had gone beyond her, beyond everything. On an outing into the city, Gatsby erupts and tells everyone in the room that he and Daisy are in love and are going to run away together to marry. However, Tom says Daisy will never leave him, and Daisy is unable to tell Tom she never loved him. Here, for the first time, Gatsby must confront directly the possibility that his dream cannot be attained, and see Daisy as she currently is, rather than his idealized remembrance of her. Even at this point, however, he remains
The climax of the novel comes when the group is driving back from New York in two cars, and Myrtle, Tom's lover, mistakes Gatsby's car for Tom's and runs out into the street and is hit and killed. The car that kills Myrtle belongs to Gatsby, but Daisy is driving. After this, the action resolves quickly. Gatsby takes the blame in order to protect Daisy, and Myrtle's husband, George, kills Gatsby, and then himself, as revenge. Gatsby has already died a symbolic death at this point, when he realizes that Daisy will not call him and is not going to run away with him after all. His dream is at last obliterated, and he heads into the morning of his death facing reality for the first time. Nick describes the world as Gatsby now sees it as unbearably ugly. He found what a grotesque thing a rose is and how raw the sunlight was upon the scarcely created grass. In contrast to the previous obsession with the past, the final passages of Gatsby's life are concerned with newness, creation, and the future, one which, lacking his dream of Daisy, he finds hideous. In the final falling action of the book, Nick must also confront reality, as he realizes his glamorous, enigmatic neighbor was the poor son of farmers who got mixed up in criminal activities and had no true friends besides Nick. Nick tries to arrange a funeral for Gatsby, but none of the guests from his lavish parties come. Daisy and Tom leave town, and Nick is left alone with Gatsby's father, who reveals the truth of his son's humble beginnings as James Gatz. After the funeral, Nick decides to return to the Midwest, where he is from, feeling disgusted by the distortions of the East. First, though, he visits Gatsby's house one last time, boarded up and already defaced with graffiti, and reflects on the power of the green light at the end of Daisy's dock that kindled Gatsby's hope of recapturing the past up until the moment of his death. So we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past, he says, including himself in the tragedy of Gatsby's fall.
Summary. The narrator of The Great Gatsby is a young man from Minnesota named Nick Carraway. He not only narrates the story but casts himself as the book's author. He begins by commenting on himself, stating that he learned from his father to reserve judgment about other people, because if he holds them up to his own moral standards, he will misunderstand them. He characterizes himself as both highly moral and highly tolerant. He briefly mentions the hero of his story, Gatsby, saying that Gatsby represented everything he scorns, but that he exempts Gatsby completely from his usual judgments. Gatsby's personality was nothing short of gorgeous. In the summer of 1922, Nick writes, he had just arrived in New York, where he moved to work in the bond business, and rented a house on a part of Long Island called West Egg. Unlike the conservative, aristocratic East Egg, West Egg is home to the new rich, those who, having made their fortunes recently, have neither the social connections nor the refinement to move among the East Egg set. West Egg is characterized by lavish displays of wealth and garish poor taste. Nick's comparatively modest West Egg house is next door to Gatsby's mansion, a sprawling Gothic monstrosity. Nick is unlike his West Egg neighbors, whereas they lack social connections and aristocratic pedigrees. Nick graduated from Yale and has many connections on East Egg. One night, he drives out to East Egg to have dinner with his cousin Daisy and her husband, Tom Buchanan, a former member of Nick's social club at Yale. Tom, a powerful figure dressed in riding clothes, greets Nick on the porch. Inside, Daisy lounges on a couch with her friend Jordan Baker, a competitive golfer who yawns as though bored by her surroundings. Tom tries to interest the others in a book called The Rise of the Colored Empires by a man named Goddard. The book espouses racist, white supremacist attitudes that Tom seems to find convincing. Daisy teases Tom about the book but is interrupted when Tom leaves the room to take a phone call. Daisy follows him hurriedly, and Jordan tells Nick that the call is from Tom's lover in New York. After an awkward dinner, the party breaks up. Jordan wants to go to bed because she has a golf tournament the next day. As Nick leaves, Tom and Daisy hint that they would like for him to take a romantic interest in Jordan. When Nick arrives home, he sees Gatsby for the first time, a handsome young man standing on the lawn with his arms reaching out toward the dark water. Nick looks out at the water, but all he can see is a distant green light that might mark the end of a dock. "I hope she'll be a fool, that's the best thing a girl can be in this world, a beautiful little fool."
Analysis. Nick Carraway's perceptions and attitudes regarding the events and characters of the novel are central to The Great Gatsby. Writing the novel is Nick's way of grappling with the meaning of a story in which he played a part. The first pages of Chapter 1 establish certain contradictions in Nick's point of view. Although he describes himself as tolerant and non-judgmental, he also views himself as morally privileged, having a better sense of decencies than most other people. While Nick has a strong negative reaction to his experiences in New York and eventually returns to the Midwest in search of a less morally ambiguous environment, even during his initial phase of disgust, Gatsby stands out for him as an exception. Nick admires Gatsby highly, despite the fact that Gatsby represents everything Nick scorns about New York. Gatsby clearly poses a challenge to Nick's customary ways of thinking about the world, and Nick's struggle to come to terms with that challenge inflects everything in the novel. In the world of East Egg, alluring appearances serve to cover unattractive realities. The marriage of Tom and Daisy Buchanan seems menaced by a quiet desperation beneath its pleasant surface. Unlike Nick, Tom is arrogant and dishonest, advancing racist arguments at dinner and carrying on relatively public love affairs. Daisy, on the other hand, tries hard to be shallow, even going so far as to say she hopes her baby daughter will turn out to be a fool, because women live best as beautiful fools. Jordan Baker furthers the sense of sophisticated fatigue hanging over East Egg. Her cynicism, boredom, and dishonesty are at sharp odds with her wealth and beauty. As with the Buchanans' marriage, Jordan's surface glamour covers up an inner emptiness. Gatsby stands in stark contrast to the denizens of East Egg. Though Nick does not yet know the green light's origin, nor what it represents for Gatsby, the inner yearning visible in Gatsby's posture and his emotional surrender to it make him seem almost the opposite of the sarcastic Ivy League set at the Buchanans. Gatsby is a mysterious figure for Nick, since Nick knows neither his motives, nor the source of his wealth, nor his history, and the object of his yearning remains as remote and nebulous as the green light toward which he reaches. The relationship between geography and social values is an important motif in The Great Gatsby. Each setting in the novel corresponds to a particular thematic idea or character type. This first chapter introduces two of the most important locales, East Egg and West Egg. Though each is home to fabulous wealth, and though they are separated only by a small expanse of water, the two regions are nearly opposite in the values they endorse. East Egg represents breeding, taste, aristocracy, and leisure, while West Egg represents ostentation, garishness, and the flashy manners of the new rich. East Egg is associated with the Buchanans and the monotony of their inherited social position, while West Egg is associated with Gatsby's gaudy mansion and the inner drive behind his self-made fortune. The unworkable intersection of the two eggs in the romance between Gatsby and Daisy will serve as the fault line of catastrophe. Summary 2. Halfway between West Egg and New York City sprawls a desolate plain, a gray valley where New York's ashes are dumped. The men who live here work at shoveling up the ashes. Overhead, two huge, blue, spectacle-rimmed eyes, the last vestige of an advertising gimmick by a long-vanished eye doctor, stare down from an enormous sign. These unblinking eyes, the eyes of Dr. T. J. Eckelberg, watch over everything that happens in the Valley of Ashes. The commuter train that runs between West Egg and New York passes through the valley, making several stops along the way. One day, as Nick and Tom are riding the train into the city, Tom forces Nick to follow him out of the train at one of these stops. Tom leads Nick to George Wilson's garage, which sits on the edge of the Valley of Ashes. Tom's lover Myrtle is Wilson's wife. Wilson is a lifeless yet handsome man, colored gray by the ashes in the air. In contrast, Myrtle has a kind of desperate vitality. She strikes Nick as sensuous despite her stocky figure. Tom taunts Wilson and then orders Myrtle to follow him to the train. Tom takes Nick and Myrtle to New York City, to the Morningside Heights apartment he keeps for his affair. Here they have an impromptu party with Myrtle's sister, Catherine, and a couple named McKee. Catherine has bright red hair, wears a great deal of makeup, and tells Nick that she has heard that Jay Gatsby is the nephew or cousin of Kaiser Wilhelm, the ruler of Germany during World War I. The McKees, who live downstairs, are a horrid couple. Mr. McKee is pale and feminine, and Mrs. McKee is shrill. The group proceeds to drink excessively. Nick claims that he got drunk for only the second time in his life at this party. The ostentatious behavior and conversation of the others at the party repulse Nick, and he tries to leave. At the same time, he finds himself fascinated by the lurid spectacle of the group. Myrtle grows louder and more obnoxious the more she drinks, and shortly after Tom gives her a new puppy as a gift, she begins to talk about Daisy. Tom sternly warns her never to mention his wife. Myrtle angrily says that she will talk about whatever she chooses and begins chanting Daisy's name. Tom responds by breaking her nose, bringing the party to an abrupt halt. Nick leaves, drunkenly, with Mr. McKee, and ends up taking the 4 a.m. train back to Long Island. Analysis. Unlike the other settings in the book, the Valley of Ashes is a picture of absolute desolation and poverty. It lacks a glamorous surface and lies fallow and gray halfway between West Egg and New York. The Valley of Ashes symbolizes the moral decay hidden by the beautiful facades of the eggs, and suggests that beneath the ornamentation of West Egg and the mannered charm of East Egg lies the same ugliness as in the valley. The valley is created by industrial dumping and is therefore a byproduct of capitalism. It is the home to the only poor characters in the novel. The undefined significance of Dr. T. J. Eckelberg's monstrous, bespectacled eyes gazing down from their billboard makes them troubling to the reader. In this chapter, Fitzgerald preserves their mystery, giving them no fixed symbolic value. Enigmatically, the eyes simply brood on over the solemn dumping ground. Perhaps the most persuasive reading of the eyes at this point in the novel is that they represent the eyes of God, staring down at the moral decay of the 1920s. The faded paint of the eyes can be seen as symbolizing the extent to which humanity has lost its connection to God. This reading, however, is merely suggested by the arrangement of the novel's symbols. Nick does not directly explain the symbol in this way, leaving the reader to interpret it. The fourth and final setting of the novel, New York City, is in every way the opposite of the Valley of Ashes. It is loud, garish, abundant, and glittering. To Nick, New York is simultaneously fascinating and repulsive, thrillingly fast-paced and dazzling to look at but lacking a moral center. While Tom is forced to keep his affair with Myrtle relatively discreet in the Valley of the Ashes, in New York he can appear with her in public, even among his acquaintances, without causing a scandal. Even Nick, despite being Daisy's cousin, seems not to mind that Tom parades his infidelity in public. The sequence of events leading up to and occurring at the party define and contrast the various characters in The Great Gatsby. Nick's reserved nature and indecisiveness show in the fact that though he feels morally repelled by the vulgarity and tastelessness of the party, he is too fascinated by it to leave. This contradiction suggests the ambivalence that he feels toward the Buchanans, Gatsby, and the East Coast in general. The party also underscores Tom's hypocrisy and lack of restraint. He feels no guilt for betraying Daisy with Myrtle, but he feels compelled to keep Myrtle in her place. Tom emerges in this section as a boorish bully who uses his social status and physical strength to dominate those around him. He subtly taunts Wilson while having an affair with his wife, experiences no guilt for his immoral behavior, and does not hesitate to lash out violently in order to preserve his authority over Myrtle. Wilson stands in stark contrast, a handsome and morally upright man who lacks money, privilege, and vitality. Fitzgerald also uses the party scene to continue building an aura of mystery and excitement around Gatsby, who has yet to make a full appearance in the novel. Here, Gatsby emerges as a mysterious subject of gossip. He is extremely well known, but no one seems to have any verifiable information about him. The ridiculous rumor Catherine spreads shows the extent of the public's curiosity about him, rendering him more intriguing to both the other characters in the novel and the reader.
Summary 3. One of the reasons that Gatsby has become so famous around New York is that he throws elaborate parties every weekend at his mansion, lavish spectacles to which people long to be invited. One day, Gatsby's chauffeur brings Nick an invitation to one of these parties. At the appointed time, Nick makes the short walk to Gatsby's house and joins the festivities, feeling somewhat out of place amid the throng of jubilant strangers. Guests mill around exchanging rumors about their host. No one seems to know the truth about Gatsby's wealth or personal history. Nick runs into Jordan Baker, whose friend, Lucille, speculates that Gatsby was a German spy during the war. Nick also hears that Gatsby is a graduate of Oxford and that he once killed a man in cold blood. Gatsby's party is almost unbelievably luxurious. Guests marvel over his Rolls-Royce, his swimming pool, his beach, crates of fresh oranges and lemons, buffet tents in the gardens overflowing with a feast, and a live orchestra playing under the stars. Liquor flows freely, and the crowd grows rowdier and louder as more and more guests get drunk. In this atmosphere of opulence and revelry, Nick and Jordan, curious about their host, set out to find Gatsby. Instead, they run into a middle-aged man with huge, owl-eyed spectacles who sits poring over the unread books in Gatsby's library. At midnight, Nick and Jordan go outside to watch the entertainment. They sit at a table with a handsome young man who says that Nick looks familiar to him. They realize that they served in the same division during the war. The man introduces himself as none other than J. Gatsby. Gatsby's speech is elaborate and formal, and he has a habit of calling everyone old sport. As the party progresses, Nick becomes increasingly fascinated with Gatsby. He notices that Gatsby does not drink and that he keeps himself separate from the party, standing alone on the marble steps, watching his guests in silence. At 2:00 in the morning, as husbands and wives argue over whether to leave, a butler tells Jordan that Gatsby would like to see her. Jordan emerges from her meeting with Gatsby, saying that she has just heard something extraordinary. Nick says goodbye to Gatsby, who goes inside to take a phone call from Philadelphia. Nick starts to walk home. On his way, he sees Owl Eyes struggling to get his car out of a ditch. Owl Eyes and another man climb out of the wrecked automobile, and Owl Eyes drunkenly declares that he washes his hands of the whole business. Nick then proceeds to describe his everyday life, to prove that he does more with his time than simply attend parties. He works in New York City, through which he also takes long walks, and he meets women. After a brief relationship with a girl from Jersey City, Nick follows the advice of Daisy and Tom and begins seeing Jordan Baker. Nick says that Jordan is fundamentally a dishonest person. He even knows that she cheated in her first golf tournament. Nick feels attracted to her despite her dishonesty, even though he himself claims to be one of the few honest people he has ever known. He had one of those rare smiles with a quality of eternal reassurance in it that you may come across 4 or 5 times in life. Analysis. At the beginning of this chapter, Gatsby's party brings 1920s wealth and glamour into full focus, showing the upper class at its most lavishly opulent. The rich, both socialites from East Egg and their coarser counterparts from West Egg, cavort without restraint. As his depiction of the differences between East Egg and West Egg shows, Fitzgerald is fascinated with the social hierarchy and mood of America in the 1920s, when a large group of industrialists, speculators, and businessmen with brand new fortunes joined the old, aristocratic families at the top of the economic ladder. The new rich lacked the refinement, manners, and taste of the old rich, but longed to break into the polite society of the East Eggers. In this scenario, Gatsby is again an enigma. Though he lives in a garishly ostentatious West Egg mansion, East Eggers freely attend his parties. Despite the tensions between the two groups, the blend of East and West Egg creates a distinctly American mood. While the Americans at the party possess a rough vitality, the Englishmen there are set off dramatically, seeming desperate and predatory, hoping to make connections that will make them rich. Fitzgerald has delayed the introduction of the novel's most important figure, Gatsby himself, until the beginning of Chapter 3. The reader has seen Gatsby from a distance, heard other characters talk about him, and listened to Nick's thoughts about him, but has not actually met him. Chapter 3 is devoted to the introduction of Gatsby and the lavish, showy world he inhabits. Fitzgerald gives Gatsby a suitably grand entrance as the aloof host of a spectacularly decadent party. Despite this introduction, this chapter continues to heighten the sense of mystery and enigma that surrounds Gatsby, as the low profile he maintains seems curiously out of place with his lavish expenditures. Just as he stood alone on his lawn in Chapter 1, he now stands outside the throng of pleasure seekers. In his first direct contact with Gatsby, Nick notices his extraordinary smile, one of those rare smiles with a quality of eternal reassurance in it. Nick's impression of Gatsby emphasizes his optimism and vitality. Something about him seems remarkably hopeful, and this belief in the brilliance of the future impresses Nick, even before he knows what future Gatsby envisions. Many aspects of Gatsby's world are intriguing because they are slightly amiss. For instance, he seems to throw parties at which he knows none of his guests. His accent seems affected, and his habit of calling people old sport is hard to place. One of his guests, All Eyes, is surprised to find that his books are real and not just empty covers designed to create the appearance of a great library. The tone of Nick's narration suggests that many of the inhabitants of East Egg and West Egg use an outward show of opulence to cover up their inner corruption and moral decay, but Gatsby seems to use his opulence to mask something entirely different and perhaps more profound. From this chapter forward, the mystery of J. Gatsby becomes the motivating question of the book, and the unraveling of Gatsby's character becomes one of its central mechanisms. One early clue to Gatsby's character in this chapter is his mysterious conversation with Jordan Baker. Though Nick does not know what Gatsby says to her, the fact that Jordan now knows something remarkable about Gatsby means that a part of the solution to the enigma of Gatsby is now loose among Nick's circle of acquaintances. Chapter 3 also focuses on the gap between perception and reality. At the party, as he looks through Gatsby's books, All Eyes states that Gatsby has captured the effect of theater, a kind of mingling of honesty and dishonesty that characterizes Gatsby's approach to this dimension of his life. The party itself is a kind of elaborate theatrical presentation, and All Eyes suggests that Gatsby's whole life is merely a show, believing that even his books might not be real. The novel's title itself, The Great Gatsby, is suggestive of the sort of vaudeville billing for a performer or magician like the Great Houdini, subtly emphasizing the theatrical and perhaps illusory quality of Gatsby's life. Nick's description of his life in New York likewise calls attention to the difference between substance and appearance, as it emphasizes both the colorful allure of the city and its dangerous lack of balance. He says that the city has an adventurous feel, but he also calls it racy, a word with negative moral connotations. Nick feels similarly conflicted about Jordan. He realizes that she is dishonest, selfish, and cynical, but he is attracted to her vitality nevertheless. Their budding relationship emphasizes the extent to which Nick becomes acclimated to life in the East, abandoning his Midwestern values and concerns in order to take advantage of the excitement of his new surroundings.